it going?
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good.
Right on. Awesome. So I wanted to start off by saying that I have a problem with my question. So atheism requires faith. I can't speak for all atheists, right? Only Sith steal absolutes, so to speak. But I think that there is a sort of normative outlook on or that is held by atheists. So I kind of want to open this up just by asking you a couple of questions just to see if we're on the same page, which I think we are, but we might not be. But I want to ask a couple of questions. I'll go into my opening contentions, and then I'll pass it to you if that works.
Sure.
Okay, so where would you say your knowledge of the world primarily derives from?
Personal experience.
Personal experience. So would you say empiricism?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So you know we kind of have the different theories of epistemology. So there's like empiricism, rationalism, like Aristotle, a priori type knowledge. You'd put empiricism at the top, and then maybe rationalism below that.
I would say yes, that would fit with divine knowledge or hidden knowledge or discovery of knowledge being at the bottom.
Right.
I put it below the bottom. I'd bury it 6 feet under.
Yeah. Not true. An unjustified belief. Right. And I don't know, slight tangent, but I think there is a little bit of room for a priori knowledge, maybe instinctual type knowledge, because I think that to a certain extent we can see that. But
I mean, we would have to discuss exactly what we mean by knowledge there.
Right. Or at least, sure. But anyway, that's getting besides the point. So I think that, so your views and my views are actually in line. So empiricism is my primary way of discovering knowledge, of learning about the world. And then below that, I have rationalism, which I think mainly applies to sort of abstract concepts, or maybe taking what I can see through empiricism a step further. Drawing inferences from empiricism is kind of the place for rationalism. But I'll go ahead and lay out my contention, and I only have one. Any way to derive knowledge about the world has problems. I'll call these problems verification gaps. And these verification gaps are what faith must fill in. And as an atheist relies heavily upon empiricism, and again, I'm speaking normatively. I'm not speaking for every atheist everywhere, because I can't. But normatively, an atheist is probably aligned with our views. They too have these knowledge gaps that require some level of faith. And I'll pass it to you.
Okay. I think considering we established what we mean by atheism, I'll skip the first part of my opening. I will go on. In the clearest language I could find, faith is broken into two categories. The first, of course, is religious faith, defined as here a strong belief in a God or doctrines of religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. I can assume, since we're both atheists discussing atheism, that we can dispense with that definition of faith. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So maybe, then that leads to,
we'll see. I don't want to cast it out yet. We'll see.
Sure. But it leads me to what I think the second category of faith is, what is complete trust or confidence in someone or something.
Right.
So in the essence, this debate to me becomes atheism requires complete trust or confidence in someone or something. So ignoring the fact that I'm not even sure what that someone or something could possibly be in regards to atheism, I think it is simply untrue that perfect confidence or absolute knowledge is required in any form for any belief, particularly a null belief like atheism, to be rationally justified. So there is no requirement for atheism to be justified. There is no requirement for faith.
Sure.
You couldn't be. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was finished. I just was pointing out that to say atheism requires faith, I think is making. I hold atheism to be a belief claim, and we can have justified beliefs that don't have perfect knowledge. I don't believe atheism is a knowledge claim where we're trying to make a a statement that we have perfect knowledge, which if we're saying we have perfect knowledge of something, that would require some faith, like the faith that hard solipsism is not true. So since if we're
Did you hear that thunder?
Yeah, I heard it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my main contention, I guess, is going to be that atheism, by any definition, because it's a belief, is never going to require faith, which I believe is a complete trust or confidence in something.
Where'd you get that definition from?
If you just look up faith definition,
Yeah.
it pops up.
That's what I just punched it into Google. So, all right. So, what would you call then the gap of knowledge? If something is not absolutely true, but you still believe in it, what word would you apply to that?
Well, I guess I don't quite understand what you're asking. We can never know that something is absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't know that we're not the only mind that exists or the only brain that exists. We can't know certain things because of the way that we experience the world. There are certain limitations. So, but I don't think, I would say that the gap is, you can have a justified belief, you can have unjustified beliefs. To hold an unjustified belief requires faith, and I don't believe that atheism is an unjustified belief.
Mm-hmm. Sure. All right. I get what you're saying. So, I mean, do you have a word that you could apply to that?
To an unjustified belief?
No. To a justified belief, right? So we have a justified belief, but there's still.
Well, I would personally call it justified belief knowledge, but that would confuse the difference between having an absolute knowledge and then having a justified belief, which is what I would consider knowledge. So I would say that a justified belief is knowledge, and not
okay.
And
yeah, so just getting into a justified belief, because a justified belief is not a claim on absolute truth, but it takes into account warrant, it takes into account probability, it takes into account rationality, the laws of logic, all these sort of things that kind of lend credence. So maybe we could put a percentage on it, like 90% likely to be true, 10% not likely to be true.
I mean, yeah, you could do that, but I wouldn't go so far as to say not likely to be true. I would go to say is impossible to demonstrate with certainty. So there are certain things that would be impossible, just simply impossible to demonstrate with certainty, like that the real world exists outside of our own brain. We can't demonstrate that with certainty. Now, with absolute certainty.
I don't know, buddy. It's not in here, so why don't you go look somewhere else? All right. Sorry, they're up later than they usually are. My mom just got into town visiting. Yeah. I'm sorry, and I missed that last 30 seconds.
No, I guess I'm just trying to answer your question, to provide an example of something that could be, I wouldn't say.
Hold on. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Hold on a second.
No problem.
All right. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I guess to answer your question, I mean, I assume you're trying to say at what point of justification, at what percentage point of justification does something become knowledge? Is that what you're asking me?
Well, I'm just throwing out there. I'm just kind of throwing out arbitrary numbers, right? So 90%. Would you call that a justified belief? So at what percentage of likelihood does it go from an unjustified belief to a justified belief?
I mean, 90%. I mean, 51%. I mean,
90%, 51%.
It depends on what. I mean, of course, it depends on what the belief is. If you're betting on a card game or you're something, I mean, it depends on what type of beliefs you're talking about. I guess I'm just trying to understand your what the point you're trying to get to.
Oh man, I'm trying to apply the Socratic method, dude.
All right.
So, what if I said the world as we understand it is about 50% when compared to any alternative?
You're saying, okay, say that again.
So we have a naturalistic worldview. I assume you and I.
Sure.
Now let's compare this naturalistic worldview to something else. I got my computer simulation debate up there. Nobody's taking me on, but let's compare it to that. Let's say it's let's compare the possibility that the naturalistic worldview exists compared to we're all living in a computer simulation. What percentage would you apply that?
I would say that it is 99.9% certain that the naturalistic worldview is true.
Why?
Like everything that we experience in any way that we're possible to experience something is naturalistic. There's no other way to describe it.
Right. So
everything that we have, every bit of evidence that we would be able to gather, I would say 100% of the evidence that we have supports the naturalistic worldview. Sure.
And where do we derive that evidence from?
Our personal experience.
Our personal experience. So empiricism.
Yes. Okay. And by personal experience, I mean like our global personal experience.
Right. Yeah.
Humanity, not my personal experience alone.
A collective, the collective whole, the collective you, so to speak. But what validates that? What says that personal experience or empiricism in general? So what I'm getting at is what proves an empiricism?
It's not that empiricism is proven. I think it's more like we have a hypothesis. We have a hypothesis that empiricism is true. That is a testable hypothesis. There could be an instance where naturalism is false, where we could just demonstrate that somehow. We've never have. So we have the hypothesis that naturalism is true. That's what we build all of our conclusions as we go on through. So it is still possible, I guess you could say, that naturalism is false, but based on the fact that the naturalistic hypothesis has never been even shaken at all, in my opinion, makes that unlikely and makes it a justified belief that that hypothesis is true.
And what do we use? You said it's testable, so I'll kind of lump naturalism and empiricism sort of together here. And they're not the same thing, but we're using empiricism to come to a naturalistic worldview. Fair enough. And then
we're using empiricism to test the hypothesis that the natural worldview is true.
So we come to a naturalistic worldview based upon our experience, upon our senses, based upon our collective knowledge, and then we also use that to test it. So you said it's testable. So we came to this conclusion based on empiricism, and we validate this conclusion with empiricism.
Right.
You've heard of begging the question.
It's not begging the question by assuming. Remember, we started out with a hypothesis. So we're not assuming anything. We're just assuming. We're not making an assumption. We're hypothesizing that naturalism is true, and then we test it with our own personal experience. But I don't know what it means to say that there is some other way to test anything that's outside of our natural experience. Right. So we're testing it with exactly 100% of what's available to us.
Yeah.
And so
Okay. And I would agree with that. We're testing it with what is available to us, or what seems to be the best way to go about testing things, the scientific method, and deductive reasoning, so on and so forth. But
I would push back a little there and say the language you're using sort of minimizes the method that we're using to say it seems to be the best method. I mean, I would say that the method that we use to test it, is the best method, and it's been demonstrated the best. Yeah. I mean, and that so much so that there's not even we can't even conceive of a better method than what we are doing right now.
Right. But that test. So all right. So you say there's no assumption in the hypothesis, but there's assumptions in the test. The assumption in the test is that empiricism is valid.
I mean, I think that follows from naturalism being valid, or the hypothesis from naturalism, but I'm not sure that it, I mean, I guess you can assume that, but just like you assume any hypothesis, but.
Right. Any hypothesis tested with the scientific method assumes empiricism to be true.
Well, yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And my question is, what proves empiricism to be true? Or even what makes it more likely to be true?
The preponderance of evidence that it is true.
The preponderance of evidence that is based upon empiricism. No? Do we have a way to test empiricism outside of empiricism?
See, I don't even know exactly what that would mean. You're saying how would you test the material world with being outside the material world? I mean, you can't be outside the material world. That's assuming that something exists that we have no evidence for. So you're making, I would say this, to assume that you can be outside of the material world is a claim that requires faith, where assuming that the material world is all that exists is just a justified belief based on the evidence that we have.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but you agree that right now, as we stand, there seems to be no way to validate empiricism.
By validate, do you mean prove with 100% certainty?
I would even say
I
would even say prove beyond 50% certainty. That's the number I'm going to go with. Prove beyond 50% certainty.
That
empiricism is.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to disagree with that. I guess I don't even quite understand what that would even look like to say that we can't prove that empiricism is true.
So would you say that
you seem to be good?
You or me, because I agree, I don't think I would necessarily be able to conceptualize it. Does that have any impact on whether something's true or not? Suppose there's something that we could not conceptualize. Could it still be true, or could it still be false?
Well, even if something that exists that we can conceptualize, it would have an impact on the world that we can observe.
Maybe.
So if something exists, then it will have an impact on the world that we can observe. If something exists and doesn't have an impact on the world that we can observe, that's the exact same thing as not existing.
Well, that's assuming a naturalistic worldview. So you see where the begging the question starts to come into here? Or?
But it's not assuming the naturalistic worldview. It is saying we have the hypothesis that the naturalistic worldview is true.
Okay.
And then we test it and we build our other knowledge on it, and we're able to move forward. We're able to understand our world. We're able to make predictions. We're able to do, basically everything that we do. And that is not, I mean, to say that that's assuming that something is true, to me, is using language that ignores just how much supporting evidence is. It's like saying we just assume that gravity is true. I mean, or that we just assume that evolution is true. Those things are not assumptions. I mean, those are tested hypotheses.
Mm-hmm. But we assume the methodology to come to that belief is true. We assume empiricism is true.
I would say we know that empiricism is true.
Here we go. All right. How do we know it's true?
How do we know it's true?
How do we know empiricism is true?
If it wasn't true, the world would be a different place than it is. We can know, for instance, if empiricism was not true, when we did experiments, we would have evidence that we wouldn't be able to reconcile with the experiment. So if naturalism is not true, we would have things that we would have, I would say we would have miracles. We would have things that don't make any sense and can't be made sense because they're impossible. If empiricism is false, we would have things that we would call impossible happen. We don't have anything that is impossible happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe miracles would happen. Maybe they're not. I'm not necessarily trying to make that case for miracles, but I drew a little diagram here, and I hope that people. Hold on, let me finish it up right here. All right, so. All right, so here we go. So is that readable? So at the top, we have the naturalistic worldview that's tested by a hypothesis based upon empiricism. We assume empiricism is true because of a naturalistic worldview. I mean, that's kind of how I see the argument laid out. And maybe you're not understanding you properly, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it. Or am I wrong?
Okay, I'm all right. I think the problem that we're having is you're considering like empiricism to be a conclusion as opposed to a method. So we could say that the way we test something is through a method. I don't know how you can say that a method is true or a method is false. A method is just a way that we look at the world, the way that we measure the world, the way that we evaluate our experiences. I mean, it's just we test them, we look at, we observe the conclusions, we test them again. I mean, that's a method. So to say that a method is false seems to me to be.
All right. So
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that's fair. I think that's a good point. So let's change that word from empiricism is true. Let's change it to empiricism is valid. So empiricism is a valid way to test things.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, we could argue we have other methods. We can say that chance or rolling the dice is not a valid way to predict. I don't know how many cars are going to come through the stoplight. I mean, if you take a couple dice, you roll them, you count the number of cars right there. We can test whether or not that is a valid method. Just not, and the method itself, the results of any tester that we do with it, it's going to either match what we observe, or we're going to say, well, no, rolling the dice, and we've got number 2 dice, 10 comes up, 11 cars goes through. Well, that didn't match. Well, let's roll it again. Let's do it again. We do that a million times. If we never get the right answer, only get the right answer 1% of the time, we're going to say, that's not really a valid method. So let's count the cars that are stopped at the stoplight and then see how many cars are going to pass once it turns green. Well, obviously counting the cars, so it's going to be a more valid method than rolling the dice. So we can evaluate any method based on the results of our experiments, if you want to call them that, or we can observe, we can make that version. Okay.
But doesn't that also use empiricism? Seems like you're using empiricism to test empiricism.
I mean, empiricism is a method. I don't know that can you use another way? When you say that what would be an alternative to empiricism?
Well, I would say that as of right now, we don't have another way. And I think that's where the faith lies.
So we don't have access to another way. Mm-hmm. So the only way that we're
right. So we don't have another way
access to.
So we don't have a way to validate empiricism. So, but yet we derive our worldview from empiricism. The possibility that it's wrong because we don't have to validate it is where the faith lies. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, I guess we have, when you're saying faith in that instance, what do you think of faith? Is the faith is in what? In faith in the method? Faith in the hypothesis being true? Faith in the conclusion that we're going to draw on using the methods are going to be correct? I mean, where do you think the faith lies? I guess that's where I'm not understanding.
Where the faith lies in empiricism being true. That's where the faith lies.
so the actor, the human being that uses empiricism, that person would have faith that their method that they're using produces results.
Valid results.
Okay, so when they use it and it produces results that are valid, then I guess are you saying that the only way that we call them valid is by having to use what our empiricism again, our senses, our experience?
Right.
So
that becomes circular logic. It becomes begging the question.
Yeah, I'm still. I don't agree with you on that it's begging the question, because we have the hypothesis that empiricism is true, and we can test it in any specific instance.
But when we test it, we use empiricism.
I guess, okay, why don't you define what you think empiricism is? Because maybe that's where our disconnect is.
Knowledge derived from senses.
So we have faith that our knowledge derived from our senses is true.
Yes. Because we have no way to validate that faith. Or excuse me, to validate that our senses are actually true. And any method that we use to validate whether our senses are true or not also use our senses.
So you're just restating this seems to be the hard solipsism problem. The hard problem of consciousness is just that we can't know that our sense experiences relate to the real world.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of tangent or part and parcel there. Sure.
But I mean, I don't see that is a faith that. So when would we develop this faith? When we're infants, do we have a faith that our knowledge to the real world, or our experiences relate to the real world? When do we develop the faith that we have? When do we develop the confidence? I mean,
yeah. I mean,
because you're using.
Go ahead.
If we can agree that for humans or even for non-human animals, that they simply accept that their sense experience is true, they accept it without the ability to believe. I mean, I assume that if they're able to eat and live, that they accept their sense experience as being linked to the real world, right? So at what point do humans then develop this faith that you're talking about?
I think that's wholly personal. I think there are probably some people out there that have no faith in their senses. We might call these people mentally ill, or we might call them, I don't know, hobos that, talk about craziness under bridges. But when the moment when someone trusts their senses or trusts empiricism as the best or the most valid way, no, I think that's sort of a journey of self-discovery, and I can't really say when.
No, I mean, I'm going to have to push back there. The moment that somebody starts trusting their sense experiences is the moment that they have sense experiences. Mm-hmm. No,
all right, you know what?
I mean,
sure, I'll see that point.
So
I agree with you. So maybe, okay. I mean, if we get kind of into, because I got a little baby, and his senses aren't fully developed. His nervous system is not fully developed. He doesn't have full agency over his limbs, what have you. So maybe I'd put that at like a year, or maybe it's on a spectrum, so to speak. So he has, okay. He opens his eyes, he sees light, he sees boob, and I think that might be more instinctual. And that might be an example of sort of the a priori knowledge we talked about.
I mean, we could even, then I could argue just simply that our acceptance of empiricism being true is instinctual, which means that if it's instinctual, then there's no room for faith, because it is just something that we do as a result of being human, or it is part of our human genetics to accept our instincts as true.
Right.
And so if it's something that we have no control over, then we can't have faith in it, because we don't have a decision. I mean, there's no. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Are you finished or no?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know how I can make that point any more broad. I mean, if we're going to relate it to an instinct, which I'm fine with saying that our acceptance of empiricism is instinctual, then because that would hold true across the animal kingdom, is that including humans. So then, I mean, I wouldn't see where faith would come in an instinct.
Well, do you think that instinct is a good way to derive knowledge?
I think now we're talking about atheism as being a justified belief about the world. So when you're saying knowledge, do I think that instinct is a good way to justify beliefs?
Now, or I want to clarify. I'm not making a claim about atheism being a justified belief or an unjustified belief. I think it's a justified belief. I'm saying that there are gaps. There are certain things that even if we call it 99, or I think it was 99.9%, right? So there's still 0.1% that is unverifiable. And where that 0.1% lies is where the faith lies. But I would even push back on that number, the 99.9% number. It maybe lower that percentage down a little bit and have a little bit more room for faith. But there's still gaps, unverifiable gaps. So yes, we trust our knowledge as a matter of instinct, right? But that doesn't necessarily validate it. It just means that this is our genetic propensity to do, or at least, obviously I'm deriving knowledge from empiricism when I cite genetics, but that's kind of how we understand where this thing comes about, right? So we're genetically predisposed to having some instincts. And one of these instincts is empiricism, to trust our senses. That doesn't prove empiricism. That just proves that that's kind of how we were designed. I hate using that word design, but that's our nature. Okay.
Let me flip it around and ask you a question this time. Okay.
Sure.
I'll use the standard, brain in the vat or the hard solipsism example. Would you say that you have faith that you are not a brain in a vat, or if you believed you were a brain in a vat, you would have faith that you were a brain in the vat? Would you say that those are both faith, that you are not or that you are?
Sure.
Okay. See, I would say that we would have faith that we were, but it would not require faith for us to be justified in believing that we were not brains in the vat.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have atheism is a not or non-claim. So if you're going to claim that something divine exists, like you're going to, or something, that reality is not as we accept it to be, then I would say that would require faith. So if you're going to make the claim that a deity exists, or you're going to make the claim that you are actually a brain in the vat as opposed to what we are, that requires faith. Where the not or the null, I don't know if I'm using null in the correct sense there, but the opposite argument that no gods exist is not a claim that requires faith, because it is saying that reality is exactly as we experience it. Right. I don't think it requires faith to accept reality as we experience it. We have no choice but to accept reality as we experience it, in my opinion. But those who don't believe in hard determinism would disagree with me. Yeah.
So I kind of touched on this a little bit in my opening statement. I'm not looking at necessarily just the claim that God does not exist, or the question of a God hypothesis, right? I'm sort of looking at the ideology of atheism, which as I tried to establish in the beginning, we kind of agree upon.
Sure.
Knowledge derived from empiricism, right? So I'm not necessarily looking at that claim per se, and maybe I could have tweaked the question to be a bit more exact, but, you know, hey, I thought this might drum up viewership. If I frame it that way.
You're not saying that all beliefs require faith. You're saying specifically that atheism requires faith.
Oh, no. I am saying I absolutely believe that all claims require faith. At least, and again, I don't want to get into absolutes because I don't want to be a freaking Darth Maul, but at least all beliefs that I've come across or can think of.
Do you have any knowledge that you said does not require faith? It seems like what you're doing is abandoning the idea of knowledge. That if you're saying that all beliefs require some sort of faith, then you're saying, in essence, since knowledge is nothing but justified beliefs, then you're saying that all knowledge requires faith, and you can't. I mean, that seems to me to be two things that are contradictory. You do not have faith and knowledge being the same thing.
So I want to draw a distinction between absolute knowledge and, like we talked about, justified belief. Because as you said, justified belief is not absolute knowledge. But anything short of absolute knowledge requires some faith. Now, I think the faith jump that I take is a teeny tiny one, right? I think the faith jump that some other belief systems take is a huge one. And I wanted to talk about this specifically because this is something that I see atheists, so to say, atheist apologists or people making the case for atheism, especially if they're not maybe really well versed on this sort of stuff. They run into problems when they start to apply empiricism in places where maybe empiricism is not useful. You get what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, I get what you're saying. And my response to that is, and when I come across people who say, well, you can't be certain of anything, you can't be certain of that your own sense experience is true. Well, to me, that's not an interesting conversation to have. If I can't be certain of my sense experience being true, then I can't be certain that you're not only existing in my mind. I can't be certain that I'm not a brain in the vat. And if any of that is true, then what we're saying is absolutely pointless. So I think I don't think there's faith involved in saying that we accept our sense experience is true. I think it's ridiculous to say that our sense experience does not correlate, at least in some way, with reality. To deny that it correlates with reality, to me, requires a leap of faith, an unjustified leap of faith. I do not think it requires faith to accept that our sense experience correlates with reality. Now, it's not saying that our sense experience perfectly defines reality. I'm not even confident that everything that I experience is exactly what reality is. I am confident that humanity as a whole over time develops a true consistency of what reality is, and I don't have faith that they get it right. I have a justified belief that they get that they get it right, that humanity gets it right, or that I have a justified belief that my sense experience is.
It almost sounds to me like it's sort of deriving from pragmatism. Now, first off, I had a funny thing I wanted to say. Sorry you took this debate if this conversation is not interesting, but I think it's interesting. I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I got you. I'm being a ball buster. Now I'm not making the claim that our sense experiences aren't connected to reality. What I'm saying is prove to me that, or at least make a compelling case that our sense experiences is tied to reality. Now, you've offered up sort of testing it by using our sense experience, which I think has flaws in it. And then I think we talked a little bit about how it's instinctual, but I don't think the fact that it's instinctual necessarily lends credence to it being true or closer to truth or false. You get what I'm saying? I'm not making the claim that it's not. I'm saying prove to me that it is.
Okay, and I would say the fact that using in empirical method, using empiricism to describe reality and make predictions about reality or make explanations of observed events and then testing those predictions, I believe that provides enough evidence to justify that sense experience is true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that you're being, not you personally, but I think that those people that deny that is enough evidence are being, I don't want to say overly sensitive is not the word, but overly skeptical they're being unreasonably skeptical. So, and if you're being unreasonably skeptical, I mean, if you're going to say that it requires faith to believe that there is, say, for instance, not a invisible pink elephant flying around in my room, to me, I mean, I don't know how to respond to that. I mean, if that's what you call faith, is my lack of a belief that there's a invisible pink elephant flying around the room, that my believing that there isn't one requires faith. I mean, I think that that's just a misunderstanding on what justified beliefs are on your part. I'm not saying that you believe that, but if someone makes that argument.
I understand.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sound a broken record here. Right. So we have a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is empiricism is valid. But when we test that hypothesis,
well, the hypothesis is that naturalism is valid.
Sure. Yeah, that's what we sort of talked about before. So,
empiricism is just a method of testing whether or not our sense experience correlate to reality. I mean, that's basically what that is, right?
So,
I mean,
so let's shelf the naturalism thing and let's just talk about empiricism. So empiricism is a valid form of deriving knowledge. Is that a testable claim?
Yes, I would say yes. It is a testable claim. It's a hypothesis, yeah.
Right.
But you're making the argument that the only way to test that is by using the only thing that we have available, which is our sense experience. So you're saying because we can't prove that our sense experience is true through our sense experience.
Right.
But I don't think that is true if I guess maybe I'm making an assumption. I mean, it seems to deny that there's a real world that exists is basically where you're coming from. Is we can't start with the assumption that a real world exists.
I mean, a lack of existence of a real world that could be an alternative scenario. There could be others, or the world as we understand it is vastly different than what objective reality actually is. I don't want to say that a real world not existing is the only possibility. If I sat and thought about it and drank enough beers, I could maybe drop some LSD. I could come up with some more. I don't know.
I guess I'm just still coming up. I'm not sure that it requires faith to believe that our sense experience correlates to reality. I'm not sure what it would mean to lack faith that your sense experience correlates to reality.
Well, I think that kind of, at least in our society now, a person who's doesn't believe, or at least we don't believe that their sensory experience correlates with reality, we would call them like a schizophrenic, right? We'd probably label them as some sort of mentally ill in some way.
Well, I didn't mean like they are having breaks from reality and they're seeing visions. What I'm meaning is that when we touch a desk, that the desk is hard, that our sense experience tells us that the desk is hard. If we observe some sort of evidence, it seems like I'm not sure how you can, to use the example there, kick a rock,
right,
get hurt by it, and then argue that I have to have faith
Sure.
that this corresponds to reality.
So real fast, we got 10 seconds. Empiricism being valid is a testable hypothesis. If we test it using empiricism, that poses inherent problems. I'm willing to accept those problems.